What if I told you that one of the richest nations on Earth once lost an entire decade? Not to war, not to natural disaster, but to money itself. A nation that had risen from the ashes of World War II to become a global economic superpower, suddenly paralyzed. Its skyscrapers gleamed, its technology amazed the world, yet behind the neon lights, its economy was collapsing, silently. This is the story of Japan's lost decade, a time when an unstoppable boom turned into an unending freeze. In the 1980s, Japan seemed invincible. Its companies bought landmarks in New York, its cars and electronics dominated the world, and the value of its land skyrocketed to absurd levels. Tokyo's Imperial Palace was said to be worth more than the entire real estate of California. Yes, one piece of land, more valuable than an entire U.S. state. But then, everything shattered. Stock prices crashed, housing prices collapsed, and millions watched their life savings evaporate overnight. Banks were drowning in bad loans, and the government's rescue attempts only made the crisis worse. What went wrong? How did the world's most efficient economy fall into decades of stagnation, deflation, and despair? And more importantly, could it happen again? Because some say, Japan wasn't unique. It was the first warning, a preview of what happens when a bubble grows faster than reality can sustain. This is not just Japan's story. It's the story of what happens when ambition, speculation, and pride collide with economic gravity. And today, as new bubbles inflate around the world, the lessons from Japan's lost decade might be more relevant than ever. When World War II ended in 1945, Japan lay in ruins. Its cities were flattened, its economy destroyed, and its people faced hunger and despair. Yet, within just a few decades, Japan would rise again, faster, stronger, and more efficiently than almost any nation in modern history. The American occupation under General Douglas MacArthur reshaped Japan's future. The U.S. implemented sweeping reforms, democratization, land redistribution, and the dismantling of powerful industrial conglomerates known as zaibatsu. These reforms, combined with massive U.S. aid and the outbreak of the Korean War, jump-started Japan's recovery. By the 1950s and 60s, Japan had transformed into a manufacturing powerhouse. Its government, through the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, known as MITI, guided the economy with precision. MITI selected industries to prioritize, provided subsidies, and coordinated exports, creating a highly efficient partnership between the public and private sectors. Japanese companies like Sony, Toyota, and Honda became global symbols of innovation and reliability. Exports surged, and Japan's GDP grew at rates averaging over 10% per year during the 1960s. The world began calling it the Japanese economic miracle. But this miracle wasn't just about factories and exports. It was about discipline, collective ambition, and a cultural belief that hard work and harmony could overcome any obstacle. Japan had not only rebuilt itself, it had reinvented the idea of success. Yet, hidden beneath that success, the seeds of the next great economic disaster were already beginning to sprout. By the late 1970s, Japan had become the envy of the world. Its companies dominated industries from automobiles to electronics, and its citizens enjoyed a level of prosperity unimaginable just a generation earlier. The Tokyo skyline glittered with ambition, a symbol of unstoppable progress. But success brought new challenges. The yen's value soared after the 1985 Plaza Accord, an agreement among major economies to weaken the US dollar. For Japan, this sudden appreciation made its exports more expensive abroad and threatened its trade-driven growth. To counter the slowdown, the Bank of Japan slashed interest rates, making borrowing cheaper than ever before. The result? A tidal wave of speculation. Corporations, banks, and ordinary citizens rushed to buy land and stocks, believing prices could only go up. Credit flowed freely, and the country entered what some economists called a speculative fever. Real estate prices in Tokyo tripled within just a few years. The stock market soared, and people began to view assets, not productivity, as the true measure of wealth. Land became a status symbol. Owning property in Tokyo was seen as owning a piece of the future. But the higher the prices climbed, the further they drifted from reality. By 1989, Japan's economy looked unstoppable, yet beneath the surface, the foundations were cracking. The bubble that had fueled Japan's prosperity was about to burst, and when it did, it would change the country forever. As the 1980s roared on, Japan was living in an age of illusion, a decade where money seemed infinite and success eternal. Banks lent freely, companies borrowed massively, and individuals invested recklessly. It was an economy on steroids, powered not by productivity, but by speculation. Low interest rates, intended to protect exports after the Plaza Accord, poured gasoline on an already overheated financial system. Property values skyrocketed to surreal levels. Entire neighborhoods in Tokyo were worth more than some countries. It was said that the land beneath the Imperial Palace was more valuable than all the real estate in Canada. The Nikkei stock index reflected this frenzy. Between 1985 and 1989, it tripled in value, peaking near 39,000 points at the end of the decade. Investors felt invincible. Office workers became day traders. Corporations borrowed against inflated property values, using land as collateral to buy more land, more stocks, more everything. Luxury became part of daily life. Expensive golf club memberships were traded like stocks, designer goods symbolized status, and speculation replaced savings as the national hobby. Even the government encouraged this confidence. Japan was, after all, the world's new economic leader. Western observers began to panic. Books like The Coming War with Japan warned that the United States would soon be overtaken. American businessmen visited Tokyo to learn Japan's secret formula for unstoppable growth. But what no one saw, or perhaps refused to see, was that the system was built on a fragile illusion. Prices no longer reflected value, they reflected belief. And when belief is the only foundation, collapse is inevitable. Japan was on top of the world, standing proudly on a bubble about to burst. By 1989, the illusion had reached its peak, and just like every bubble in history, what followed was inevitable. The Bank of Japan, alarmed by the runaway speculation, decided to act. In late 1989, it raised interest rates for the first time in years. The move was meant to cool the market, but instead, it triggered a chain reaction that no one could stop. Almost overnight, the speculative fever broke. As interest rates rose, borrowing became more expensive, and investors began to sell their assets to cover debts. The stock market collapsed. By 1992, the Nikkei index had lost more than half its value, erasing trillions of dollars in wealth. But the real estate crash was even worse. Land prices, which had seemed untouchable, started falling, slowly at first, then in free fall. Corporations that had used their property as collateral suddenly found themselves trapped with debts far greater than their assets. Banks were flooded with non-performing loans, loans that could never be repaid. And yet, instead of cutting their losses, Japanese banks engaged in what economists would later call evergreening. They extended new loans to struggling borrowers to make the old ones look healthy on paper. It was financial denial, a refusal to admit the collapse. For ordinary citizens, the effects were devastating. Homeowners saw their property values plummet. Workers faced stagnant wages and layoffs. For the first time in decades, Japan's once unstoppable economy had come to a halt. The dream of eternal growth had ended, replaced by a chilling reality, an economy frozen in place. And as the 1990s began, no one yet realized how long the winter would last. The 1990s began with silence, the kind that follows an explosion. Japan's miracle had ended, and what replaced it was something the world had never seen before, a slow-motion collapse that would last for years. Economists called it the lost decade, but the truth is, it stretched well into the 2000s. At first, the government believed it could fix everything. The Bank of Japan cut interest rates back down, hoping cheap money would revive growth. But confidence, once shattered, doesn't return easily. Companies stopped investing, consumers stopped spending, and prices began to fall. This was deflation, a nightmare for any economy. When people expect prices to keep dropping, they delay purchases, which in turn weakens demand even more. The economy spirals downward, not through panic, but through paralysis. To fight it, the government launched massive stimulus packages, pouring billions into infrastructure projects, new bridges, highways, even airports. But these spending sprees created little more than bridges to nowhere. The debt piled up, while real growth remained stagnant. Banks, still hiding their losses, became too afraid to lend. Zombie companies, firms that should have failed, stayed alive only because banks couldn't afford to let them die. Innovation slowed, productivity flatlined, and an entire generation of young workers entered what became known as the employment ice age. Japan's once vibrant society turned cautious. The optimism of the 1980s was replaced by resignation. Savings increased, consumption decreased, and economic energy seemed to vanish. What began as a financial crisis had evolved into a psychological one. Japan hadn't just lost its wealth, it had lost its confidence. And while the world watched in disbelief, few realized that Japan's silent collapse was revealing a warning, one that other nations would one day ignore at their own peril. Japan's story might sound distant, a cautionary tale from another era. But look closer, and you'll see its reflection everywhere. In the United States during the early 2000s, history began to echo. Low interest rates and easy credit fueled a housing bubble eerily similar to Japan's. Home values soared, debt exploded, and banks once again believed that risk had disappeared. The result? The 2008 financial crisis, a global collapse that wiped out trillions of dollars and forced governments to rescue their economies, just as Japan once did. And then came China. In the 2010s and 2020s, China's property market grew into one of the largest bubbles in history. Massive cities with empty skyscrapers and ghost apartments became symbols of speculative excess. The pattern was unmistakable: rapid growth, overconfidence, and the belief that prices could only rise. Even today, in the age of technology and cryptocurrencies, the same psychology drives markets. Artificial wealth, inflated valuations, and the fear of missing out, all the ingredients of Japan's 1980s are still present, only dressed in modern clothes. What Japan lived through wasn't just an accident of time or culture. It was a glimpse into the universal cycle of human behavior: greed, denial, and the illusion of endless prosperity. Every generation believes it's different. Every market thinks it's immune. But Japan's lost decade reminds us that when speculation replaces value, when faith replaces logic, the end is always the same. The question is not if another bubble will burst. It's where and when. Japan's lost decade is more than a story about numbers, charts, or interest rates. It's a story about human nature, about what happens when success blinds us to reality, when optimism turns into arrogance, and when economies forget that growth cannot last forever. The tragedy of Japan wasn't just economic, it was emotional. A generation that believed in progress watched its dreams dissolve into stagnation. The lesson is clear: no matter how advanced a nation becomes, no economy is invincible. Today, as global debt climbs, asset prices soar, and digital speculation reaches new heights, Japan's experience whispers a warning: prosperity built on illusion always fades. But knowledge is power. By understanding Japan's past, we can recognize the signs before they appear again. Because the true danger isn't the bubble itself, it's forgetting that it ever existed. If you've learned something from this story, if it made you question how fragile wealth and confidence can be, then don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel and join us as we uncover more financial mysteries, hidden crises, and the lessons history keeps trying to teach us before it's too late.